This story happened about 10 years ago, but whenever my wife or I think about it, we still get goosebumps. Today, my son is 13 years old. He is a normal, sports-loving, busy teenager who doesn't possess even a blurry, distant memory of this entire chapter. But as his parents, that unsettling, chilling, and ultimately breathtaking experience is permanently etched into our minds. It is a story of a beautiful connection, a lingering shadow, and a mother's protective instinct that successfully defied the boundaries of death. My mother-in-law was an incredibly vibrant, funny, and cool woman. She and my wife were exceptionally close. They were more like best friends than just mother and daughter. Sadly, after a brief and sudden illness, she passed away when our son was only about 4 months old. The grief was indescribable. My wife was completely devastated, carrying a heavy heartache because her mother never got to see her baby grow, laugh, or speak. Fast forward about 2.5 years. We rented a place in Pasadena, California. It was a beautiful, old 1930s-era craftsman-style house. It had character original hardwood floors, high ceilings, and that distinct vintage architecture. The house had an undeniable charm, but like many properties from that era, it also carried a certain heavy, settled stillness. Our son was around 3 years old at the time. He was a sweet, quiet toddler who was perfectly content playing in his own little world. The first few months were entirely uneventful. Our son played in his room, and we were caught up in the rhythm of our work schedules. I worked a standard Monday through Friday job, while my wife worked in retail, meaning her shifts often landed on Saturdays and Sundays. Everything was normal until one particular evening changed everything. One night, I was giving my son a bath. He was splashing around, laughing, and playing with his toys in the tub. Suddenly, he went completely still. His eyes locked onto a point directly behind me, staring intently right over my shoulder. He wasn't just aimlessly looking around. His pupils were fixed, tracking something with absolute concentration, the way a child looks at a person standing right in front of them. That specific, unblinking stare toddlers give can make any parent feel incredibly uneasy. I instinctively glanced back over my shoulder, but there was nothing there, just the empty bathroom wall and the open doorway. "What's up, buddy?" I asked. A long moment of silence passed. Then, he looked up at me with pure innocence and asked, "Dad, why does Grandma call Mommy that funny name?" My hands froze mid-air. Assuming he was talking about my own mother, his living grandmother, who visited us occasionally, I tried to keep the conversation light. "What name, buddy?" "Grandma just calls Mommy by her regular name." He shook his head slightly, frustrated that I wasn't understanding him. Then, he uttered the words that made the blood in my veins turn to ice. "No, Dad. She calls her." He said the highly specific, incredibly unique nickname that my mother-in-law had given my wife when she was a baby. It wasn't a common, generic pet name like Sweetie, Honey, or Princess. It was an unusual, deeply personal word. In the 3 years since my mother-in-law had passed, neither I nor my wife had used that name even once. There were no old home videos playing it, no written journals lying around with it, and absolutely no way a 3-year-old could have fabricated that exact word on his own. My throat went dry. Trying desperately to keep my voice steady so I wouldn't scare him, I asked, "Hey, who told you that name, buddy? Who said Grandma calls Mommy that?" He looked back down at his bath toy, splashing it casually, and replied, "The farmer told me." "The farmer? Who is the farmer?" My heart was hammering against my ribs. "My friend," he said with a small smile. When my wife got home from her retail shift later that night, I sat her down and told her exactly what happened. The moment I uttered the nickname, she burst into tears. She was completely overwhelmed. On one hand, there was the profound, emotional realization that maybe her mother was still around, watching over us and speaking to our son. On the other hand, the mention of the farmer filled us both with a creeping dread. Who was this farmer? And why was he telling our 3-year-old things that were deeply guarded, my wife and her late mother? We tried to comfort each other by rationalizing it as just an imaginary friend who somehow triggered a wild coincidence even though, deep down, we knew that explanation didn't hold weight. Exactly 1 week later, it was Saturday. My wife was at work, and it was just my son and me at home. It was the middle of the afternoon, and the house was draped in a quiet, weekend stillness. My son was in his bedroom playing with his toys, and I was in the living room taking care of some paperwork. Suddenly, I heard the distinct sound of murmuring coming from his room. I stood up and crept down the hallway, stepping lightly so the old floorboards wouldn't creak. Standing just outside his half-open door, I looked in. He was sitting on the rug, surrounded by his action figures and blocks, but his face was turned toward the empty space across from him. He was engaged in a full, two-way conversation. He would speak, pause as if listening intently to a reply, and then speak again. "Yes," he murmured. A pause of a few seconds followed. "No." Another pause. "I don't know that." And then, he let out a genuine, happy giggle, as if someone had just told him a funny joke. Watching this play out, my mind immediately raced to horror movies like The Exorcist and the infamous Captain Howdy scenes. A cold shiver traveled straight down my spine. It felt like an unseen, intrusive presence was operating right inside my child's bedroom. I pushed the door open and stepped in. "Hey buddy, what are you doing?" He blinked, startled out of his trance. "Playing, Dad." "Who are you playing with?" I asked, scanning the empty corners of the room, even though I knew we were the only two physical beings in the house. "The farmer," he answered in a completely matter-of-fact tone. "Oh yeah? Well, where is your farmer friend?" "I don't see him," I said, trying to mask the rising panic in my chest. He pointed directly to the empty space between his window and the closet and said, "He left when you came in." The fuck? The words screamed in my mind. This wasn't a standard toddler's imaginary friend. My son was interacting with an energy or a presence that he could see clearly, but to which I was completely blind. When my wife came home that evening and I recounted the afternoon, the color drained from her face. We were officially creeped out. We had no idea what to do. Do we call a priest? Do we pack up and break the lease? We ultimately decided that if anything like this happened one more time, we would have to intervene. Only a few days passed before the climax arrived. It was the dead of night, somewhere between 2 a.m. and 3 a.m. The entire neighborhood of Pasadena was completely silent, and the only sound was the occasional, faint creak of our 1930s house settling in the dark. Suddenly, a voice cut through the silence. It came from our son's bedroom right next door. It wasn't loud, but because the house was so quiet, the words carried perfectly across the hallway. My wife and I snapped awake at the exact same instant. We locked eyes in the dark. Without uttering a single word, we threw off the blankets, slipped out of bed, and rushed to his room. My heart was pounding so loudly I could hear it echoing in my ears. We reached his doorway and looked in. My wife flipped the light switch, illuminating the room. Our 3-year-old son was sitting straight up in his bed. He wasn't sleepwalking, and his eyes weren't heavy, he was wide awake, staring directly into a corner of the room. Just before we had turned on the light, we both distinctly heard him say to the empty air, "Grandma says you and I can't be friends anymore." The air in the room felt bizarrely crisp and cold, almost as if the temperature had dropped significantly over the course of a few minutes. I rushed over to the bed and lifted him into my arms. His skin felt a little chilly, but he was completely calm. "Are you okay, buddy? What's going on? Who were you talking to?" I asked, trying to keep my voice from shaking. He looked at my wife, then at me, and with an incredibly peaceful, casual shrug of his shoulders, he said, "Yeah, Dad. Grandma says I can't play with the farmer anymore." He said it with the absolute certainty of a child who had just received a strict but loving instruction from a parent. It was as if his grandmother had walked right into the room, assessed the situation, firmly told this farmer entity to pack up and get away from her grandson, and banished him from the house for good. Following that intense night, the entire atmosphere of our Pasadena home shifted. That heavy, inexplicable dread and the underlying tension that had plagued the house for weeks completely evaporated, replaced by a profound sense of light and peace. Morning came, followed by weeks, months, and eventually years. Our son never mentioned the farmer again. Not even once. He never repeated the nickname, and he never stared into empty corners. It was as if, after that midnight intervention, the radio frequency connecting him to the unseen world had been permanently cut. Today, he is 13 years old. Occasionally, just out of curiosity, we will casually ask him if he remembers any of his old friends or a farmer from when we lived in the old house. He just looks at us with a blank expression, laughing it off as if we're making things up. He doesn't retain a single fragment of the memory. The human brain has a way of washing away memories that don't fit into the logical, rational world we build as we grow up. But my wife and I remember. We will never forget. We aren't overly superstitious or deeply spiritual people, but that experience forced us to realize that the bonds of love don't simply end when a heartbeat stops. My mother-in-law, who loved her daughter fiercely, had passed away too soon to watch her grandson grow. But when an uninvited, lingering spirit from the past, perhaps an old farmer who had lived on that Pasadena land before the house was built in 1930, started getting a little too close to her grandson, her maternal protective instincts transcended the grave. She used her secret baby nickname for my wife to prove beyond a shadow of a doubt that it was really her, and then she drew a hard line in the sand to protect her family. It began as a terrifying, bone-chilling haunting, but it remains in our hearts as a beautiful testament to the fact that a mother's love is fiercely permanent. Even now, we know she's still keeping watch.